Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Wavelength.
The real issue with data privacy is who's collecting your data behind the scenes, so in the back end of it, and who is that being shared with.
Sparking the combos about Adelaide.
It's every woman's choice. If they choose to have an abortion, then so be it.
You should be having.
These issues need to be properly investigated, and we need to make sure that LGBTIQ people are supported to be who they are.
On Fresh 92.7.
Welcome to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. I'm your host, David, and tonight we've got a show that will have you absolutely frothing for times gone by. Those pre-COVID days I feel like I totally took for granted. It's certainly warming up in Adelaide, and the best thing about this time of year is the music festivals. Well, it would be if not for a global pandemic. But other groups are putting them on around the world, so what are some models that we can look to? We'll also be letting you know everything you need to know about the coronavirus this week, but next we're shining a light on an amazing initiative called Sober in the Country. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. So this week, that conversation is about sobriety in Australia's rural areas. It's basically an Australian pastime to sink a few beers at the pub, but for many, struggles with alcoholism can be fatal. This is especially the case for those isolated in the country, which is why we're shining a light on an amazing organisation called Sober in the Country, who are helping rural Australians say no to beers in the bush.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
It's no secret Aussies love a drink, but for many people, it can far too often become a problem. With many in rural areas of our country struggling to get support for their drinking issues, what exactly can be done to help them? Well, one charity, Sober in the Country, is working hard in these areas to establish some assistance and support. I spoke with their CEO and founder, Shanna Wan, about the work they've been doing.
So, mate, basically our charity began as a conversation, and that conversation was generated off the back of my own experience of descending into alcoholism quietly in front of my entire community and almost dying. But, you know, because I sort of worked 14-hour days and had a successful business and a decent haircut, I thought there's no way I could be in serious trouble. It's extraordinary how often that happens. So today, that national charity basically is an extension of what my own survival and recovery story was, so that other people may benefit from some very, very honest and, in my humble opinion, very overdue conversation in the rural sector. So we basically do three things. We work through broad-scale advocacy, which in other words is me sort of going into bat and fight for country people at a national political advocacy and policy level. I ruffle as many feathers as I can, as often as I can, because we're really desperately needing to see change happen in services and support to bush people. So that's one aspect of what we do. The other thing I do is I travel as a speaker. But the third thing I do is we have a peer support network called the Bush Tribe, which is basically a laser-focused online support group where country people can get together and have a yarn about their own drinking, where they're at, and just pick the brains of other like-minded people who've been there in their shared journey to drink less or not at all. So, yeah, we've sort of got a finger in a few pies, but our goal is to change the culture of drinking in the bush through positive education and inclusive yarns.
Would you feel comfortable sort of perhaps telling us a bit more about your own situation and what led you to starting the organisation?
Yeah, so when it was me in the fight, in other words, you know, I had come to the realisation that I was in very, very big trouble. I was blackout drinking on a regular basis, but as I mentioned earlier, because I held a serious job and had a successful business, I don't know, I just kept denying that there was a really serious life and death issue happening. And it wasn't until I almost lost my life that I took action. And when I did take action and when I did, you know, seek a bit of help, it was just ridiculous. The barriers, the challenges, the hurdles were almost insurmountable. And so it was my own experience as a rural woman choosing to recover from alcoholism in a rural space. You know, I would go to GPs or specialists who would be so ill-equipped to deal with me and my situation because they simply don't even necessarily understand themselves what this disease is. You know, so they do their best, but out in the country, services and support are overstretched and often the mark is missed terribly. And I just, you know, no disrespect, because half the poor people out in the rural sector are stretched to the limit and exhausted and fatigued and carrying a massive workload. And we find that someone like me just slips through the crack because nobody really knows what to do with a high-functioning alcoholic in country Australia. People don't know where to send us, how to speak to us, or how to even diagnose it. So when I was trying so hard to get help, and I tried for a long time, and I just kept failing and failing and failing, look, it was just a mess. It went for such a long time, and I simply just didn't want that to be someone else's story. You know, once I was well and truly on the way, I thought, man, oh man, this has got to change. This is just a shocker. Our system out here is just not equipped for any of this. But, you know, for me, I was a very typical higher functioning alcoholic. I was a blackout drinker. I didn't drink till after 5, but once I started, I couldn't stop. And a lot of our mates just call that being Australian. But for me, I finally acknowledged it with alcoholism. And it's a very scary place to find yourself.
Why do you think problem drinking is an issue in rural areas, perhaps compared to urban centres? You know, do you think people are being pressured into drinking at all?
I think, in all honesty, Andrew, alcohol addiction, abuse, misuse is the same all over the globe. It's everywhere. Our charity and myself as an individual speak on behalf of the rural sector purely because very little attention is given to our demographic. So the problems that manifest are no different to anywhere else in the globe. But what is unique and what is different about rural alcohol addiction and abuse is exactly what I was saying before, which is that when somebody identifies there's an issue and chooses to seek out a bit of help or support, the options are ridiculously limited compared to our mates in the city. So, for instance, right, in the city, you might be able to go to any one of dozens and dozens and dozens of anonymous recovery support meetings for free, as an example. You can't do that in the country because, 1, you can't be anonymous. 2, you're probably going to be lucky to even find a meeting. So there's that issue of confidentiality in a country town. People are very afraid of stigmas and what will people say and think and do, and that alone can send people scuttling back to the safety of their homes because it's overwhelmingly terrifying approaching that in your own mind, let alone going and seeking help publicly. So that's very, very much a rural-based issue. Distance, geography, lack of alternatives socially is another one that we find. And the culture of alcohol in the bush is definitely geared heavily towards alcohol because there's just less options at a glance, say, when compared to the city or the coast. You know, we tend to get together at the pub on a Friday afternoon and travel for miles to join our mate, or it's a backyard barbecue, or it's sport, or it's a horse event, or whatever it might be. And historically, a lot of bush events are sort of punctuated by grog at the end of it, which is all good and well if you don't have an issue with alcohol. But if you do, and you do give up or cut back, you find that you're suddenly left without a lot of alternatives socially. So it really does underpin our social network. So it's a tricky one. It's a very, very tricky one for bush people.
And so I guess it's sort of a tough challenge to face when, as you said earlier, sort of drinking is such an ingrained aspect of Australian culture, I guess. What do you think are the most sort of important aspects of recovery? Is it support, sort of self-determination?
Oh, there's definitely a mixture, and there's no one size that fits all. That's probably the key thing I reckon I've learned after not just recovering myself, but now, advocating on a broad scale. There is no linear way to recover, and there is definitely no one size that fits all. But there's a few universal truths that most of us seem to agree upon, which is you can't just stop drinking and be cured. It's not that simple. You've got to attack it with multiple approaches, from physical health, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, all sorts of health aspects. It's a complex thing to tackle, and definitely not about willpower, but it's about willingness. And a lot of people go in with a stubborn determination to beat, quote unquote, the addiction cycle. But it's actually it's not really about being stubborn and using willpower for most of us. We discover that it comes down to just being really honest, acknowledging there's an issue, wanting the help, seeking the help, and then accepting that help when you find it. But it can be a really, really treacherous journey for people because, as we were discussing before, it's just this glorified, accepted, revered, worshipped drug that our society has at its very centre. So when you're the one person in 10 that, has an issue, it's a weird place to be. So there's a lot of stuff from acceptance to honesty to changing a lot of things in order to get your own health back on track. Support is absolutely essential, and because of the very great lack of that in the rural space, online support in the form of peer support is turning out to be a really, really critical part of the whole puzzle. So that's mates helping mates online, because that's the only way you can do it in the bush with the massive distances involved. So there's that. There's professional and clinician support, which is also imperative. So e.g. go to your doctor, psychologist, counsellor. You might go and enlist a naturopath. Whatever it is that works for you, we just basically say to people, don't stop investigating options that make sense to you or resonate with you, and just be relentless in the pursuit of restoring your own health. And it could look like different things to different people, but yeah, there are lots of common factors, definitely.
What advice would you have for those who think they may have an issue with problem drinking?
Yeah, that's the most famous question of all time. There's a really old rule. It's a very old school comment from a century ago, really, which is if you think you've got a problem, you most likely do. You know, and I certainly was thinking for a long time, I wonder if this might be a problem for me. You know, it was always in the back of my mind. People generally know that there's something about where they're at that is just a little bit different to others. You know, and so if you've got that little still quiet voice whispering in the back of your mind going, something's not right here, I could just only ever encourage people, really listen to that voice and take action and go and do some research. Jump on the internet in the privacy of your own home and just start there if you need to. And the wonderful thing is, thanks to the internet, thanks to advances in technology, etc., there is so much support and so much technology geared towards helping people recognise how to know if it is an issue, what that looks like, you know, what things to look out for, what first steps to maybe take if you have identified that, oh my gosh, this is definitely me, and where to go next. So just listen to your gut, listen to your voice, because the problem is people who are in a really serious problem drinking cycle, weirdly enough, will often not even be honest with their professional. And I was exactly the same. I was the person who'd go to the doctor and go, oh yeah, it's not that bad. And I'm not sure why we do that. I don't know if we're trying to please the professionals or what goes on, but you've got to be so honest about where you're actually at and be very, very willing to then take the advice and suggestions that are given off the back of that. But nothing will change if we're not going at it with total heartfelt honesty from the get-go, if that makes sense. So the great news is, like I was saying before, in Australia, there are so many organisations, foundations and initiatives geared towards alcohol behaviour change. So there's a ton of that. As far as I know, we are the only charity that works specifically in the rural space. So if one of your listeners is perhaps tuning in today and they're in the bush, they're a busy rural person, farmer, agronomist, they might own a property, they might work in town in a small business, and they resonate, you know, with this discussion and they're struggling to escape that beer culture, I would really encourage them, pop along and have a look at our website, which is soberinthecountry.org. We've got some amazing stuff on there. We've got a beautiful, beautiful peer support network built in called the Bush Tribe. They can click on the Bush Tribe link and apply to come and join and be part of the amazing discussions we have there. So it's full anonymous, confidential peer support. So, you know, if someone's listening and thinking, gee, I wouldn't mind having a bit of a feeding and chat about this stuff, that is such a great place to land and just discuss things very candidly. They may wish to watch. We did an episode of Australian Story about a year ago. We've done a ton of other media and podcasting, and there's all sorts of downloads people can make from the website to catch up and just, we really delve into, you know, what is problem drinking? What did it look like for me? What does it look like for others? It's really, really good stuff. You know, we delve right into it, and it's from a lived experience, boots on the ground, rural person's perspective, and more people are getting involved, and it's just such a positive thing that we're doing. So, you know, I just encourage people, come and have a look at our website, soberinthecountry.org, have a read, have a look, get involved, join the Bush Tribe, and be encouraged that you are most definitely not alone. If you're a bit, you know, you're struggling and you're in isolation, which of course is our normal, and you just need a bit of support and a place to go and have a yarn. It's a beautiful network that we've created, and we just welcome anybody.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That was Andrew chatting with Shanna Wan, the CEO of Sober in the Country, about all the good work that they do. You can find out more about the organisation at soberinthecountry.org. Anyway, coming up after the break, we'll be cracking into our main investigation of the evening about how to put on a festival in the time of COVID-19. You're listening to Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength with David this evening, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. It's really heating up at the moment, and this type of weather has me absolutely fanging to chuck on some stupid clothes and buy overpriced drinks at the many Adelaide music festivals we normally have here every summer. But this is no normal summer. We're still trying to contain that outbreak of COVID-19 in Adelaide, and it doesn't look like music festivals as we know them will be going ahead. But what will festivals look like once they're allowed in SA? Amila spoke with the organisers of Rebound Festival in Darwin about how they recently pulled off the gig.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
While it's been hard to have a sense of normalcy this year, people in Darwin had the chance to let loose at Rebound's High Energy Music Festival. Despite its rescheduling and a change in the lineup, the event went smoothly and had people in the Northern Territory meeting others from WA and even SA. I talked to publicity manager Elle Worthington about Rebound's success and what it could mean for the future of Aussie festivals. So the Rebound Festival went ahead on October 3rd, and by all accounts, it sounds like it was a total success. So did it manage to go off without a hitch and without too many problems?
In the lead up, I have to say there were definitely quite a few issues. It was in the middle of Melbourne in lockdown, so organising some of the artists and logistics and stuff was quite difficult. But yeah, the event day went without a problem. We had a great day. We were sold out. When you found out, that Melbourne was kind of heading into a lockdown, was there any preparation for scenarios that you didn't expect or anticipate? There's no COVID in the Northern Territory, so like nightclubs, venues, everything's been operating as normal with full capacity since about August. So it wasn't something we expected to have to change everything around again. It was quite difficult convincing artists to get into quarantine and come up to the show, but it was definitely challenging. I would say the most challenging part was just convincing people that it was actually going to happen. Yeah, how did you manage to communicate with the artists and kind of get them on board and say, listen, it's still going to happen, I just need you to do this and wait it out for me? Some were not at all interested, others were ecstatic. Like Illy was so keen to come up to the show. He was more than willing to go into quarantine. All the artists were insanely ecstatic. Some of them hadn't played a show since February, January, or even this year. The crowd was amazing. Everyone was very well behaved from a festival point of view. It was a great energy. There was a lot of, on the day, people being like, can you believe this is actually happening? So you mentioned that people were pretty happy to regulate with the rules. So would you say that people that were attending weren't too cautious? Were they just happy to jump into it? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no one's really very cautious at a festival, are they? But it's hard to explain because Darwin is so lax about everything happening in Darwin because their borders are so strict. The people that are coming to the festival have been living in Darwin this whole time, most of them, and they're used to being able to go out to clubs and dance and drink standing and do everything you've not been able to do in other states this whole time. So they were very excited for a festival, but I think it's just very easy for them to forget that it's not possible to do that in other states. It was difficult. I mean, we had to go through all the extensive event planning coordination with NT Government and NT Health and make sure that we were following their COVID guidelines. But at the same time, you encourage social distancing. But in Darwin, it's not particularly necessary because there's no cases of COVID. So it was still very, very difficult and a massive team effort in making the festival happen. So you mentioned there were a lot of difficulties. What would you say was the biggest challenge when you were trying to organise this? I would say rearranging all the travel and logistics for artists in and out of hotspots. And again, trying to convince people to buy tickets and travel from interstate when the border closures were so up and down and uncertain. Trying to convince artists they should go into quarantine to come up here. And also from a publicity side, trying to get national coverage when Melbourne was mid-lockdown and there was a huge scandal happening there with their Medi hotels and whatnot. So what kind of protocols did you guys try and keep in place to keep things safe for all of those who came along? Well, we operated under a COVID-19 event safety plan that was approved by the Northern Territory Government. But again, operationally, we're back to normal here. So we had extra toilets and we had more bars so people weren't congested in areas. We had 2 stages so that we had 2 different areas for people to walk around. It's outdoors, so that's another tick. Are you hopeful or optimistic that you can see other parts of Australia kind of endeavour to do this? And what kind of advice would you give for organisers who would be willing to give that a shot? Absolutely. I wouldn't say I have advice for event organisers. It's more the government to get more involved and be more proactive and supportive of those event operators.
There's a lot happening interstate. I mean, in Sydney, I think they still can't stand and dance, but the government has started to support a bunch of shows happening and going ahead that are all seated, which is great. But unfortunately, with what's just happened in Adelaide, I mean, didn't really seem like SA government were keen on anything going back ahead anytime soon without extreme event safety plans. It wouldn't surprise me if festivals are going ahead in Melbourne before they are back in SA.
Would you say you had any problems, arranging anything with the NT government and their side of communication?
No, they've been absolutely amazing. NT government and NT Health have been very supportive. They absolutely understand that hospitality is a huge part of Darwin. It's a tourist town, and they reopened everything as soon as they could, and they, have been very supportive of us in our festivals and events going ahead.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Amila speaking with Elle Worthington about the success of the festival and the complexities of putting on a music festival in 2020, giving us a bit of an idea of what we can expect here in SA soon. The organisers of Rebound actually have another festival coming up literally this weekend in Darwin, boasting an insane lineup including acts like Bliss and Esso, Mallrat and Timmy Trumpet. If you're keen of escaping some COVID restrictions here in SA and making your way up north, you can grab tickets via Tickaboo, but act fast as they are selling very fast. Anyway, later in the show, we're going to look overseas for some more examples of festivals in the time of COVID-19. But next, Andrew will let you know what the hell has been going on with politics this week. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength. We'll be getting back into our story on festivals in the time of COVID-19 soon. But now let's throw to Andrew to let us know what the hell is going on with politics this week.
What the hell is going on in politics at the moment? Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Another week, another round of weird and wonderful events on the political stage. Well, first off, and with the coronavirus still spreading across the world, our former Finance Minister Matthias Cormann has been jetting around Europe to spruik his candidacy for Secretary-General of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's aka the OECD. The problem is that he's been using an RAAF plane to travel, which reportedly is coming with a price tag of just over $4,000 per flight hour. That's all charged to taxpayers, but Prime Minister Scott Morrison's defended the measure, saying Mr Cormann otherwise would have caught coronavirus using commercial flights. Jetting back home now, and New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian's once again landed herself in hot water over a range of issues. Firstly, she confirmed on breakfast television that she didn't self-isolate while waiting for COVID test results, and secondly, admitting that her government splashed millions of dollars specifically on seats they held to help gain votes. But that's all good according to the Premier, who says it's not illegal. Meanwhile, this week, China has continued its trade campaign against Australia, with tariffs of up to 200% on Aussie wines being imposed. The federal government says it's extremely disappointed by the move, which comes just weeks after tons of seafood were left on a Shanghai runway, and just days after $700 million worth of coal was held up at Chinese ports because of so-called environmental issues. Many suspect the rising tensions are due to our push for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. And to cap it all off, we're headed back to the US, where President Donald Trump continues to claim the election of just under a month ago was rigged. However, Mr. Trump says he will leave the White House if the Electoral College confirms President-elect Joe Biden the winner. The Electoral College will meet on December 14 to confirm the vote, with the president's latest comments coming just after yet another legal challenge from his team was dismissed in Pennsylvania. And that's what the hell's going on in politics this week.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Stay tuned for the rest of our feature on COVID-safe festivals coming up after the break. But right now, though, you're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength. Before the break, we heard from Elle Worthington, a music festival organiser in Darwin, about how they managed to put on an amazing music festival in the top end earlier this year, despite COVID restrictions. But they're also managing to party overseas. So we spoke with some promoters and organisers outside of Australia to get even more of an idea of what festivals in SA might be looking like very soon.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Looking overseas, our friends over in the UK are definitely feeling the impact of the pandemic after a lockdown was announced in October and is due to end on the 2nd of December. To understand what's really going on, I talked to Artistic Director and CEO of Capsule, Lisa Mayer, about the way the Supersonic Festival adjusted to the ever-changing situation.
Well, I think at the moment we've had to really stick to online events as opposed to anything in person, because most of the venues that we would work with in Birmingham certainly are either closed or they're, like Town Hall Symphony Hall, which is normally, say, 1,200 capacity. If it was operating on a socially distanced capacity, it's about 100 people, but it still costs the same $4,500 just to open up, because they still need all of the staff in and security, etc. So it just doesn't work out for us to go into venues at this stage, and we felt it was better just to kind of stick within the parameters of working with online, because we knew what we could do in that sense.
Professor Alex Gandalis, lecturer in marketing at the University of Lancaster.
Well, it's really unfortunate, actually, especially for independent, for smaller music venues worldwide. And COVID-19 has had a devastating influence so far, particularly on local music scenes and smaller venues and local music communities. I would say if we want to protect the cultural heritage of the live music industry, and particularly of smaller venues that are tied to local places, to local communities, governments, city councils, other relevant authorities as well, they need to support further smaller venues. And this type of support doesn't only need to be financial, but also more intangible, by working and collaborating with them to come up with more creative ways to help them survive, actually.
Would you still get the same sales that you look for if you were to host the event online?
Not at all. I mean, if you think that something like Supersonic, we probably bring in about £100,000 worth of ticket income, not to mention bar income and, having stalls and food stalls and etc. And when we did Supersonic, I think we brought in about 7,000, and that was also selling merch as well. I mean, obviously our costs weren't nearly as high, but it definitely, the two do not equate. So you have to really remodel what your output is as well.
What kind of plans do you have for how Supersonic would run next year then? Are you hoping to still follow a Sofasonic format, or are you hoping to see that some of these restrictions will ease and some live events will be held?
I think at the moment we're thinking of a hybrid model and this idea of a phased return. So almost seeing next year as a stepping stone to maybe 2022, where things might have more freedom and flexibility. But as I've been talking to my team about that, I feel like we really have to be a bit white-knuckled about it and almost hold out until March, April to see where we're at then to make a decision. Because at the moment, particularly around legislation, things are changing week by week. 4 weeks ago, we were in Tier 2, then we went into a lockdown. Now we're about to come out of a lockdown, and we don't know whether Birmingham will be a Tier 2 or a Tier 3. There might be a vaccine by April. So there are so many moving parts at the moment that it feels like if we commit too strongly to one element, then we might be missing out. But at the same time, if we sort of think about the lowest thing that we can do in terms of a digital model and then building on top of that elements of live, I think that's probably the best bet for us, and taking our audiences on that journey with us.
Do you think that digital concerts could still be an option in a post-COVID world?
I think so. I think that digital will still be an option. I think that both our artists and audiences, they need to be extremely critical when it comes to the transformation of the live music industry and to move towards the digital. Because, of course, digital cannot simulate or substitute the real thing. And we need to keep in mind that the power of live music lies in local scenes, in local communities, in festivals, which offer more tangible and collective experiences to their audiences.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Amila speaking with Lisa Meyer, the CEO and Artistic Director of Capsule, and Alex Scandalas, lecturer in marketing at the University of Lancaster. Some amazing insights, and really it's just making me want to get excessively sunburned at a music festival myself. Anyway, next Wavelength explains everything you need to know about what's happened with the coronavirus this week. But right now, you're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Right now, we're getting into our weekly segment where Wavelength explains what has happened with the coronavirus this week.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Currently, there are 62.7 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide. The UK has reported 215 deaths in the past 24 hours, with the total death toll standing at 58,245. Italy is also facing a strong resurgence of coronavirus with 20,648 confirmed cases. They've seen over 1,000 deaths over the weekend. At home, Victoria has recorded a month of 0 daily cases and has no current active cases. Workplaces with their workforce still working from home will be allowed to return 25% of their staff per site. As a result, there will be no delay in SA opening the borders to Victorians from midnight. Queensland has announced it will keep its borders closed from SA for another week, wanting the situation to be perfectly safe before allowing for unrestricted travel. Back home, concerns of the Parafield cluster spreading further remain after a man attended several shops while contagious. SA Health have confirmed the man did not breach quarantine orders and had been deemed a casual contact, directing him to isolate only if he started to experience symptoms. Over 4,200 tests were conducted yesterday, with a pop-up site near Theobarton Community Centre remaining open to test others until Friday. The total number of confirmed cases linked to the cluster remain at 33.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Amila letting you know everything you need to know about the coronavirus. You're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the conversations about Adelaide you should be having. Right now, we've got our weekly segment called Heaps Good News, and this week, Ant's got the goods for us.
Heaps Good News on Wavelength.
You know, I'd hate to be the bearer of bad news. So for the next couple of minutes, I'll present to you a small snippet of the good news which occurred over the last week. Starting first interstate, you may not have heard about the courageous Trish Lemon, a clinical nurse consultant who has just been awarded as a joint winner of the New South Wales Nurse of the Year award. She has had an intense year which started in February when she was sleeping in a tent and helping bushfire-affected residents of Batemans Bay. Then, after having less than a week at home, she went to the origin of COVID-19 in Wuhan in order to help bring Australians back home. From there, she returned to set up COVID-19 clinics in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Such selfless acts from an incredible person and well deserving of the highly prestigious honours. Staying with healthcare, but moving locally, a large donation from an anonymous donor has helped the South Australian remote town of Inaminka to open up a medical centre. Although the town has a permanent population of 13 people, it services many contractors living in the Cooper Basin, as well as many people travelling through the town. The medical centre will give residents and visitors access to GPs and dental and mental health services. This has given a lot of people a sense of security, as being over 1,000 kilometres north of Adelaide, it can be very hard to access these services when required. Moving to environmental news now, and in the Pilbara, an individual from the critically endangered hawksbill turtle species has returned to its former nesting spot after 30 years. The turtles generally have a low chance of survival, with only 1 in every 1,000 eggs laid succeeding. This discovery gives hope to the conservation programs now in place through the collaboration of turtle monitoring volunteers and wildlife researchers. Moving across the ditch now, and a New Zealand couple has decided to gift 900 hectares of farmland to the local government instead of selling it to private developers in order that it can be enjoyed by all New Zealanders. The land is situated at the base of the Remarkables mountain range and also adjacent to Lake Wakatipu, making it highly desirable by some of the world's billionaires who live nearby. This gift to the community will ensure that a portion of biodiversity will remain in the region after the rest is quickly converted into high-density residential properties, an international airport and a private hospital. So there you have it, just some of the good news that occurred over the last week. We will be back next week on Wavelength to provide you with plenty more.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Thank you for that, Ant. Anyway, that brings us to the end of tonight's show. Thank you so much for listening, Adelaide. Make sure you're subscribed to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can listen back to our old episodes right now, and you'll be the first to know when tonight's episode goes up. Anyway, see you next week, and stay safe, Adelaide.
Wavelength.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.